Adrian filed for divorce 11 days before the final launch review for Meridian-1, the guidance system I had spent 6 years building. He told me he'd loved someone else since 2019. He did not know I had 2 years of recordings, 412 pages of grant transfers, and exactly enough patience left to use them. He told me on a Tuesday, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on, like he wanted an exit already lined up. I had a torque wrench in one hand and a half-eaten protein bar in the other. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should put the wrench down before I said anything, because it looked like I was about to hit him with it, and some old, tired part of me still cared what that would look like. I didn't put it down, I just listened. "I want a divorce," he said like he was reading it off a checklist. I should have said something years ago. That's the scene. Now let me back up, because none of it makes sense without the rest. I am a guidance engineer. My whole job is knowing exactly where something is, exactly how fast it's moving, and exactly where it's going to end up if nothing changes. I built my career on the idea that if you measure carefully enough, nothing has to surprise you. My grandfather taught me that before NASA did. Wendell Callaway spent 31 years as a navigator in the Merchant Marine, back before GPS made his whole profession sound like a magic trick. He kept a brass sextant in a wooden case on the mantel of his house in Providence, and when I was 9, he showed me how to use it to find our position from nothing but the angle of the sun and a clock. 2 things he told me: where you are and when you are. Everything else you can work out. After he died, I kept the sextant. I never use it to navigate anything. I use it the way some people use a rosary. When something knocks me sideways, I go outside, I find 3 fixed points, real ones, a water tower, a church steeple, whatever's around, and I take a fix. I locate myself. Then I can think. Remember that detail. It matters later, in a way I couldn't have predicted the day Adrian said the word divorce like it was a technical correction. By then we'd been married 11 years. I was the lead for guidance, navigation, and control on Meridian-1, an autonomous lunar descent system that Halyard Aerospace had been building under a NASA contract since I was 31 years old. Adrian was my co-investigator on the underlying research grant, $4.6 million over 5 years, and the person with signing authority over how that money moved. We had built the lab together. We had built the marriage in the cracks around it, evenings and weekends, the way you build anything you assume will hold on its own. I told myself the coldness was normal. 2 years before that Tuesday, I lost a pregnancy at 19 weeks. Adrian was at a conference in Denver when it happened, and by the time he got back, I had already been discharged, already emptied the nursery paint cans out from under the sink myself, already decided that grief was something I did efficiently, on my own schedule, the way I did everything else. He held me exactly once, the night he got home, and then he went back to work, and I told myself that was just how he processed things. Some people needed distance. I told myself that so many times it stopped sounding like an excuse and started sounding like a fact. There was a name he said sometimes, not often, just enough that I noticed the pattern and filed it under weather, not warning. Someone from before me, from high school, from a life I hadn't been in. Naomi would have loved this conference, he'd say, or Naomi always said Aspen in March is a mistake. Dropped so lightly I never once asked who Naomi was, because asking felt like I'd be making something out of nothing. I was not making something out of nothing. I was 11 years off by exactly that much. Silas Reyes showed up 6 weeks before that Tuesday on a Thursday morning with a government badge, a scuffed leather folio, and no interest whatsoever in small talk. Routine compliance review, he said, setting a folder on my desk like it weighed nothing, though I'd find out later it weighed considerably more than that. Financial audit, tied to your NASA cooperative agreement. I need about 2 hours of your time, and I'll need to speak with your co-investigator as well. I assumed he was mid-level. Compliance people always dress like they're trying not to be noticed, and Silas Reyes dressed like a man who'd bought exactly 4 shirts in his adult life and made peace with the decision. He asked good questions, specific ones, about subcontractor invoices and travel reimbursements, and he wrote my answers in a small paper notebook instead of typing them, which struck me as almost quaint for a federal employee. "You do this a lot?" I asked, mostly to fill the silence while he worked through a stack of my own expense reports. "Enough," he said, not looking up. "Most of it's nothing. Somebody miscoded a line item, somebody's grad student expensed a hotel minibar. I close those in an afternoon." "And when it's not nothing?" He looked up then. It was the first time he'd really looked at me instead of the paperwork, and something about it made me feel unexpectedly, uncomfortably seen. "Then I stay until it is," he said, "one way or another." I didn't think much of it at the time. I had a launch review in 6 weeks and 11,000 other things demanding my attention. I did not clock that he'd asked to see Adrian's expense report specifically twice, or that he'd underlined one line item 3 times before he closed his notebook. A stranger with a government badge had just told me, as gently as a man like that is capable of telling anyone anything, that somebody's numbers didn't add up, and I still did not think of it as the first thing in 6 weeks that would actually matter. For the first couple of weeks after that visit, nothing happened that I could point to. That's usually how it works. The ground doesn't shift all at once. It just gets a little softer, and you don't notice until you're the only one still standing on it. Adrian started staying late reviewing invoices, which was funny in retrospect, since invoices were exactly what he should have been worried about. He started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. He started saying Naomi twice in 1 week, then 3 times like a man who'd stopped bothering to ration something he used to hide. I asked him once lightly, the way you ask about weather, "Who is Naomi exactly?" "Someone from high school," he said, not looking up from his laptop. "We reconnected at a reunion last year. She's going through a rough patch. I've just been a friend." I wrote it down, not because I suspected everything yet. I wrote it down because I've written everything down since I was 22 years old and lost an entire semester of lab data to a corrupted drive. Memory is a liability. A notebook is not. Last year, rough patch. 3 words that would matter enormously, and 1 date that would matter more. Because 11 months later I would find a receipt proving that reunion happened 4 years before he claimed, not 1. Then, 6 weeks almost to the day after, a stranger with a government badge sat in my office asking about subcontractor invoices. Adrian told me he'd loved someone else since 2019, standing in our kitchen with his coat on, and asked for a divorce like he was returning a rental car. He moved out in 4 days. Not 4 days after that conversation, 4 days period, boxes packed, a sublet already signed, a moving truck already booked. The kind of 4 days that only happens when a man has been planning his exit for considerably longer than he's been announcing it. "You could have told me you were thinking about this," I said, the night he left, standing in a living room that suddenly had gaps in it, a lighter rectangle on the wall where a photo used to hang. He looked at me the way you look at a spreadsheet with an error in it, mildly annoyed, slightly bored. "You would have made it a whole thing," he said. "You always do. You'd have wanted to talk about my feelings for 6 months before you let me leave." "I didn't have 6 months, Vivian. I had a launch review." That was the first time he used the mission as a weapon instead of a shared thing we'd built. It would not be the last. Here is what I didn't tell him, standing in that half-empty living room. I had been documenting for 2 years already, long before Silas Reyes ever walked into my office with his folder and his 4 shirts. It started after the miscarriage, in the months when Adrian was traveling for the grant. More than the grant, by any reasonable accounting, required travel. I noticed things a wife notices and immediately talks herself out of noticing. A hotel charge in a city with no conference in it. A joint account that dipped by the same amount on the same day every month, like a subscription to something I'd never signed up for. I didn't confront him. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't strength and it wasn't strategy, not at first. It was fear. If I was wrong, I would have humiliated myself over nothing. If I was right, I would have to blow up not just a marriage but a federal grant, a 5-year program, 40 jobs, and the first mission I had ever been trusted to lead, over a hunch I couldn't yet prove. So I did the only thing I know how to do with an unverified variable. I started measuring it. 14 months before that Tuesday, on a night I'd rather not describe in detail, I called an anonymous federal hotline at 11:40 p.m. and told a recorded line that I thought grant funds might be getting misused on our program, that I wasn't sure, that I might be wrong, and I hung up before I finished giving details, because a siren went off somewhere outside and I convinced myself it was a sign to stop being paranoid. I forgot about that call almost immediately. I want that on the record too. I did not spend 14 months feeling clever about it. I spent 14 months feeling ashamed of it, the way you feel ashamed of anything you did out of fear and then buried. What I did not forget how to do was write things down. Every strange withdrawal, every reunion that turned out to be the wrong year, every night he came home smelling like a restaurant we'd never once eaten at together. I filled 2 notebooks and close to 2 years of intermittent recordings I'm not proud of and don't regret, and I told myself it was just for me, just so that someday, if I needed to prove I hadn't imagined my own marriage, I would be able to. I did not know when I started that somewhere in a federal building 40 minutes away, a folder with my hotline call in it had been sitting open for over a year, waiting for exactly one more data point to move. Silas came back 9 days after Adrian moved out, this time with a second folder and considerably fewer pleasantries. Flight readiness review is in 19 days, he said, not a question, just a fact he wanted confirmed. I need to close my preliminary review before then. Once a program's under a launch clock, everything gets harder to pull clean. You say that like the launch is inconvenient for you? It's inconvenient for whoever's been moving $8,250 a month through a subcontractor called Meridian Documentation Solutions, LLC, he said, and watched my face very carefully while he said it. You ever hear of them? I hadn't. I told him so, and something in his shoulders came down half an inch, like a man setting down a weight he hadn't wanted to keep carrying alone. Good, he said, that's good. Good that I'm telling the truth, or good that I'm not involved? Both, he said, mostly the second one. It was the closest he'd come to admitting he'd been worried about me specifically, not just the grant, and I found I wanted him to say more, which surprised me, given that my husband had moved out 9 days earlier and I was, by any reasonable measure, not in a position to want anything from anyone. We ended up in the parking garage an hour later, both of us leaving at the same time, both of us apparently unwilling to just say goodnight and go. My car wouldn't start. Dead battery, the kind of small mechanical betrayal that feels enormous on a week like that one. Silas didn't call anyone. He popped his own trunk, pulled out cables like he kept them there for exactly this purpose, and knelt down next to my bumper in a government issue button-down, getting grease on his cuff without seeming to notice or care. You don't have to do this, I said. I could call somebody. I am somebody, he said, not looking up. Hold the clamp, red to red. We didn't talk while the car charged. We just stood there in the fluorescent buzz of the garage, and at some point he handed me a coffee from the gas station across the street, black. No sugar, exactly how I take it, though I hadn't told him that. Lucky guess, I don't guess, he said. I've been reading your expense reports for 6 weeks. You buy the same coffee every Tuesday at 7:14 a.m., creature of habit. That's either the least romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, or the most, and I genuinely can't tell which. For the first time since I'd met him, Silas Reyes smiled just barely one corner of his mouth, like it cost him something to spend it. Take the win, he said. I don't hand those out often. 3 days later we ran the final descent simulation before the software freeze, the last chance to catch anything before the flight code got locked for launch. It caught something. 20 minutes into a nominal run, my terrain relative navigation model threw a fault I hadn't seen in 18 months of testing, a false positive hazard detection that would have triggered an unnecessary abort 40 meters above the surface, on a mission with no do-overs and no repair crew. Denise Callahan, who has sat at the console next to mine for 4 years, and has never once let me have a bad day without narrating it back to me afterward, froze the simulation and looked at me across the room. You want to call it, or you want me to? She asked, meaning, are you steady enough right now to lead this, or do you need me to run interference? I've got it, I said, and I meant it, and for 40 entirely focused minutes I was not a woman whose husband had moved out 9 days earlier. I was a guidance engineer with a fault to isolate, and it turned out I still remembered exactly how to be only that. We traced it to a lighting angle edge case in the crater the model hadn't been trained against, patched it by 2 in the morning, and reran the simulation clean 4 times before I let anyone go home. You didn't have to stay for all 4 runs, Denise said, driving me to my car at 2:40, the lot empty except for us and a security light that buzzed like it was tired too. I did, actually, I said. I don't get to be the person who almost missed something, not this month, not with everything else. She didn't ask what I meant by everything else. She just reached over and squeezed my hand once hard, the specific squeeze of someone who already suspects more than you've told her and is choosing, for now, to let you decide when to say it. For what it's worth, she said, you didn't miss it. That's the whole job, Vivian, not missing it. I thought about that sentence more than she probably intended. I was by then already not missing several things I used to let myself not see. I found out who Naomi really was on a Sunday at Adrian's mother's dining table, 3 weeks before the launch review, because Eleanor Cole has never once in 11 years missed an opportunity to make a point without saying it out loud. "I saw Naomi Sinclair at the market," she said, passing a bowl of green beans like this was ordinary conversation. "She's back in town, did you know? Working at the hospital now, she looks wonderful." I looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at his plate. "That's nice," I said, because I still did not know, at that table, that I was watching my mother-in-law casually reference the woman my husband had been redirecting federal research funds to support. "I always thought," Eleanor said, to no one in particular, in the specific tone mothers use when they mean it for exactly one person, "that Adrian and Naomi were going to end up together, back in the day. High school sweethearts. Some things just take the long way around, I suppose." Adrian's jaw did something small and controlled. I would learn later that this was as close as he ever came to embarrassment. I didn't say anything. I filed it. Whether I'd called it once, that name dropped so lightly I never asked. It had never once been weather. It was the actual forecast, and everyone at that table except me had apparently been reading it for years. I confronted him 3 days later in the kitchen of the house he'd already half moved out of, holding a printed bank statement instead of a wrench this time. "Meridian Documentation Solutions," I said, sliding it across the counter. $8,250 a month, for at least 14 months that I can prove, out of our research account, for a subcontractor that doesn't have a website, a phone number, or a single deliverable on file. "You want to tell me what documentation they've been producing?" He didn't even reach for the paper. "It's $40,000, Vivian," he said, a number so far from the real one it wasn't even trying to be believed. "You've spent more energy chasing that than you've spent on this marriage in years. I stopped being your priority a long time before I stopped being your husband. Maybe ask yourself why." That was the second time he tried to make his betrayal my fault, and it landed harder than the first one, because some small, tired, 11 years married part of me almost believed him. I did not cry in front of him. I want that on the record. I went out to the driveway instead, in December, without a coat, and I found 3 fixed points in the dark: a church steeple 2 blocks over, a water tower behind the school, a porch light I didn't recognize, and I took a fix the way my grandfather taught me, because I needed to know exactly where I was standing before I let myself feel anything about how I'd gotten there. I met Naomi Sinclair exactly once before everything came apart, at a pharmacy of all places, both of us reaching for the same shelf of cold medicine on a gray Wednesday in January. She recognized me before I recognized her. I could see it happen, the specific flinch of someone realizing they're standing 4 feet from a person they've been actively, if quietly, wronging. "You're Vivian," she said, not a question. "I am." She had the decency to look uncomfortable, which I noted and did not yet know what to do with. "I didn't know he was still married when it started again," she said, fast, like she'd rehearsed it and needed to get it out before she lost her nerve. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I just needed you to hear it from me instead of from him, because he's not going to say it accurately." "Started again," I repeated, "so there was a first time?" Something crossed her face, quick and complicated, gone before I could name it. "You should ask him about the consulting money," she said instead, which struck me, even then, as a strange thing to say, half a warning wearing the costume of a confession. "He told me it was a signing bonus from some new defense contract." I didn't ask questions I probably should have asked. I did not know, standing in that aisle with a box of decongestant in my hand, that I was looking at someone who would eventually hand federal investigators the single most useful sentence of the entire case. I just knew I didn't hate her as cleanly as I wanted to, and that bothered me more than almost anything else that month. Silas, when I told him about it 2 days later over coffee that had become a standing, unofficial, entirely too frequent Thursday habit, went very still. "She said consulting money," he said, "documentation services. Does that matter?" "It might matter enormously," he said, and wrote something down in the small notebook, and didn't explain further, which by then I'd learned meant he was protecting something, not hiding it. I let it go. I was starting to trust the shape of his silences, which is a strange thing to trust in a man, but there it was. "Can I ask you something that isn't about the case?" I said. "You can ask. Why does this one matter to you? You said most of them close in an afternoon. This one's taken 6 weeks and it isn't done yet." He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. because somebody made an anonymous call 14 months ago. He said finally, scared enough to report it and scared enough to hang up before finishing. Most people never call back. I kept the file open anyway. I don't like unfinished things. I didn't think in that moment to ask who made the call. I had spent so long assuming I'd been carrying this alone that it didn't occur to me the file he'd kept open for 14 months and the phone call I'd spent 14 months trying to forget were the same object, viewed from two different rooms. Adrian found out I'd been meeting with investigators 9 days before the review. I don't know exactly how. I suspect Eleanor, who has never in her life kept a secret she thought might be useful as a weapon later. Or maybe he'd simply class his government plate in the garage often enough to draw a conclusion. It doesn't matter how. What matters is what he did with it. He went to Halyard's internal security office and reported concerns about my access to sensitive program data, citing the emotional volatility of an ongoing personal separation as a risk to the mission. He used those words, emotional volatility, a phrase built entirely to sound clinical while doing something vicious. They pulled my badge for a standard precautionary review on a Tuesday morning, 4 days before flight readiness, and took my laptop at the same time, citing data security protocol, calling it routine, promising it wouldn't affect the review, saying all the things people say when they need you to stay calm long enough not to make a scene in the lobby. I did not make a scene in the lobby. I went home, and I sat on my kitchen floor, in the exact spot where a man I'd loved for 11 years had once told me he wanted a divorce like he was requesting a refund, and for the first time since any of this started, I let myself consider the possibility that I was going to lose everything at once. My marriage. My evidence if the laptop held what I thought it held and someone got to it before I did. My mission, 4 days before liftoff, over a man's lie about my emotional state. I did not have my grandfather's sextant with me. It was still on a shelf at the house I no longer fully lived in, so I did the only other thing I knew how to do. I called Silas. He picked up on the first ring. "They took my laptop," I said, and I heard, for the first time in this entire ordeal, my own voice shake. There was a pause, brief, controlled, the sound of a man recalculating something faster than he wanted to let on. "Vivian," he said, and it was the first time he'd used my first name without a case number attached to it in his voice. "Listen to me very carefully. What was on that laptop?" 2 years of notes, some audio, everything Was any of it something you'd already sent to my office? I stopped. Some, not all. "Then it's not gone," he said. "It's inconvenient, it is not gone. And Vivian, if you were ever in danger of losing this, I would not let you lose it alone. Do you understand me? Whatever happens Thursday, you are not doing it by yourself." It was the most he had ever said to me that wasn't about the case, and I believed every word of it, and it still did not stop the small, cold, familiar fear that had been living under my ribs since the day a man I loved looked at me like a line item and asked me to leave. The breaking point came 2 days later, the morning before the formal review, in a conference room with NASA's mission logo on the wall and 11 people around the table, when Adrian stood up during a personnel readiness briefing and said, in a calm, reasonable, devastating voice, that he had concerns about my fitness to lead the guidance team through launch. "She's been unstable since the miscarriage," he said. "Ask anyone. I think we all want this mission to succeed. I don't think it's cruel to say that out loud." Marian Ashworth, who has run NASA's side of this program since before I had a security badge, who once told me in this exact building that she'd fought 11 years to get a woman in my seat, did not say a word. She just looked at me, and I watched something in her expression I can only describe as the specific disappointment of a person deciding, in real time, whether to believe a rumor about someone she'd trusted. That was the moment, not the divorce, not the money, not even the laptop. It was watching Marian Ashworth's face do the math, in front of 11 people, because a man I used to love had just weaponized the worst night of my life to protect himself 2 days before the thing I'd spent 6 years building was supposed to leave the ground. I did not raise my voice, I did not cry, I stood up and I said exactly one sentence. "I'd like to request a closed session with the review board and the Office of Inspector General before this meeting goes any further." Then I sat back down and I waited, and for the first time in this entire year, I was not afraid of what happened next. The closed session happened 40 minutes later, 5 people in a windowless room, Marian Ashworth, Halyard's general counsel, Silas Ray as Adrian, and me. Silas went first, which told me, before he said a single word, that this was no longer my case to carry alone. 14 months ago, he said, laying a single sheet of paper on the table, this office received an anonymous tip alleging financial misconduct on the Meridian research grant. The caller did not complete the report. We opened a preliminary file regardless. Over the following year, my office independently subpoenaed banking records for every authorized signatory on the grant's disbursement account. He slid a second document across the table. Between March of last year and this month, Silas continued, 22 payments totaling $181,500 were authorized under a single signature and routed to a subcontractor entity registered to Naomi Sinclair. Ms. Sinclair has confirmed, in a statement provided to this office 3 days ago, that she understood these payments to be personal consulting income, not federal research funds, and that Adrian Cole represented them to her as exactly that. Halyard's general counsel, a woman who had said maybe 6 words in the entire meeting up to that point, added one more for the record. I'll also note that Mr. Cole's security complaint against Dr. Calloway was filed 1 day after he became aware of this inquiry. We consider that retaliatory, and it will be treated as an aggravating factor going forward. The room was very quiet. I'd like to note something else, Silas said, and here his voice changed, just slightly, into something no longer entirely procedural. The anonymous tip that opened this file 14 months ago came from a call placed at 11:42 p.m. on the night of March the 4th. I've since confirmed the originating number. He looked at me, not at Adrian, at me. It was yours, he said. You were the one who started this. I didn't know that until 3 weeks ago. I want that on the record too. I felt something in my chest come loose that I had been holding so long I'd forgotten it was a held thing at all. 14 months. I had spent 14 months certain that scared, unfinished phone call had done nothing, had changed nothing, had been one more thing I'd failed to see through. It had done everything. It had been sitting in a federal file the entire time, waiting, the way a fixed point waits to be used, useless until the moment someone finally takes the reading. Adrian, to his credit or lack of it, did not deny the numbers. He looked at me instead, and said the only true thing he'd said in 11 years. You were always going to find it, he said. You find everything. That's the whole problem, Vivian. You always have. It wasn't an apology, I don't think he had one in him, but it was finally an accurate description of exactly who I am, said by the one person who should have known it best and used it against me anyway. I didn't watch the moment Naomi Sinclair understood what she'd actually been part of. She told me about it herself weeks later, over coffee neither of us particularly wanted to be having, and I've put it together as close to how she described it as I can. Investigators showed her Adrian's own texts, the ones where he called the $8,250 a month her, half of the settlement he was owed for consulting work that never existed. She sat in a small room with 2 federal agents and her own bank statements highlighted in yellow, and somewhere around the 4th highlighted line, she stopped defending him and started answering every question they asked, plainly, completely, because whatever she'd told herself about the 2 of them, she hadn't signed up to the reason a NASA program got shut down. She wasn't charged, the money had moved through his signature, not hers, and she genuinely believed the story he told her, badly enough and long enough to be more of a casualty than a conspirator. But she spent 3 days answering questions under oath, and she had to pay back $11,000 she couldn't prove she'd have taken if she'd known where it came from, and the last thing she said to me over that coffee was the closest thing to an apology I ever got out of either of them. I thought I was the exception, she said. I don't think there's ever an exception. I think there's just people who haven't found out yet. Flight readiness review happened on schedule 2 days after the closed session, and Adrian was not in the room. Halyard terminated him within 72 hours of Silas's report, citing violation of federal grant compliance standards. NASA's Office of Inspector General formally referred the matter for federal prosecution the following week. $181,500 in misapplied federal research funds, 22 counts, a signature on every single one of them that was not mine. His mother stopped answering my calls, which I understood and did not mourn. Meridian-1 launched on a clear Thursday morning in March, 11 days after the review that almost ended everything, and I stood in the guidance control room with a headset on, and my grandfather's sextant in my coat pocket, because some fixed points you carry with you even when you don't strictly need to take a reading. The descent sequence I had spent 6 years writing worked exactly the way I'd promised 11 different review boards it would. Touchdown confirmed, 41 meters from the target ellipse, well within tolerance. The room did the thing rooms do when 6 years of work turns out to have been correct. It went completely silent, and then it did not stay silent for very long at all. By that evening, 2 stories were running on every major outlet in the country, and they were, whether the producers intended it or not, the same story. A guidance engineer named Vivian Calloway had landed a spacecraft on the moon with a precision that made 3 separate news anchors reach for the word flawless. And her former research partner, a man named Adrian, was facing federal fraud charges for stealing from the very program that had just made her name a headline. I did not plan that timing. I only ever controlled one half of it. But I will admit, without much shame, that I did not mind, not even a little, that the whole country found out what he'd done on the same day they found out what I'd built. Silas found me an hour after the landing, out behind the control building, where I'd gone to get 5 minutes of quiet before the debrief started. "You didn't answer when I asked if you wanted to celebrate," he said. "I wanted to take a fix first," I said, and pulled the sextant out of my coat pocket. And he didn't ask what that meant, because by then he'd learned not to need an explanation for every strange thing I did with my hands when I was feeling something too large to say out loud. I found 3 points without trying. The gantry still lit up against the dark. The water tower past the perimeter fence. Him standing close enough that I didn't have to look far to find the 3rd line. "Different landmarks than last time," I said. "Good ones, though," he said. "Where do you make yourself out to be?" I thought about 11 years with a man who filed for divorce like a line-item correction, and 14 months of a phone call I'd been ashamed of, and 2 years of a notebook I'd kept out of fear, and 1 moon landing that had gone exactly, precisely right. "Home," I said. "I make myself out to be home." He didn't say anything clever back. He just took my hand, the one still holding the sextant, and held onto it the way you hold a fixed point after a long time at sea, when you finally stop needing to keep checking it to believe it's real. I had spent 2 years documenting a man who could not tell the truth. It turned out the only reading I ever needed to take was of the one person who never once made me ask him to. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.